You have been misled about the history of European civilization. What you consider tragic coincidences actually appears to be a perfectly planned erasure of memory. Take any major city in Europe and try to find property documents before a certain date. You will discover a systemic void. History becomes clear, understandable, and documented precisely at the moment the city burns to the ground. Not before, not after, but on the very day. Why does the fire in the London bakery specifically destroy the ledgers and feudal rights that hindered the city's redevelopment? How is it that in Prague, the flames selectively erased exactly those volumes that restricted the king's power? Why was the plan for the new city in Lisbon ready when the old one was still smoldering? And why was it necessary to burn the archives and their copies in different parts of Paris on the same day? We are told about fallen candles, vengeful servants, and random sparks, but the facts tell a different story. The power that could not change the rules of the game while the documents were intact changed them immediately after the documents turned to ash. The main question is, who exactly transferred the rights to half of Europe while the cities lay in ruins? There are things that history prefers not to explain. Not because it does not know, but because the explanation is too uncomfortable. Imagine that you want to find out who owned a piece of land in central London in 1665, or to locate a marriage record of your ancestor in Paris dated to the 17th century, or to restore legal rights to an estate that your Czech family owned during the time of Charles IV. You will open the archive and discover the same thing: emptiness. Not just a gap, a systemic emptiness that begins precisely at the moment when a fire occurred in these cities. Not before, not after, but at that very point that coincides with the date of the catastrophe. Take any major European city with a history spanning several hundred years. Find the moment when its history becomes clear, detailed, and well documented. When precise maps, neat registries, and clear boundaries of plots emerge. Most likely, this moment is preceded by a fire, not a small, localized one, but a blaze after which the city ceases to be itself. Before the fire, fog. Confusing borders, ancient feudal rights, documents that have been passed down from hand to hand for centuries, and which no one dared to contest. After the fire, clarity, new plans, new registries, new rules, new owners. This is not a coincidence or irony of fate. It is a pattern that you will now see in 4 examples. 4 cities, 4 centuries, 4 different countries. And each time, the same result. The power that could not change the rules in the presence of documents changed them as soon as the documents disappeared. Fire is the cheapest way to rewrite history. It leaves no traces of intent. And what remains after it is exactly what those who stand nearby need. Let's start from the very beginning, from Prague, from the year 1541. From the archive that couldn't be touched by hands. In medieval Bohemia, there existed a special kind of document known as the land tables. Essentially, this was the legal constitution of the Czech nobility. Everything of significance: who owned the land, what rights were granted to each noble lineage, what decisions had been made by the Diet, what judicial sentences had been pronounced, was preserved in the books of the land tables. The books were named by colors: the Book of the Color of Parrots, the Book of the Color of Death, the Yellow Book. This system operated from the 13th century and functioned without fail for almost 300 years. It is important to understand that this was not just archival storage. It was a living legal tool. If your rights are not recorded in the land registers, they do not legally exist. No line means no lineage. Want to claim an estate? Present the record. Want to contest someone else's ownership? Cite the volume number and page. Want to prove that your lineage served the king before your competitor emerged? Here is the book. Here is the line. Here is the date. This system had one rule that seems strange until you understand its meaning. Books could not be taken out into the courtroom. During proceedings, they were read from the balcony. Outsiders did not touch the volumes. They were not handed to the litigating parties, not because it was tradition, but because those who created a system understood a simple truth. A document that can be taken and removed can also be destroyed. Therefore, they did everything to prevent that from happening. It worked for almost 3 centuries. On the 2nd of June, 1541, a fire broke out in the Prague district of Mala Strana. It spread to the Hradčany and approached Prague Castle. Nearly 200 houses burned down. The flames reached St. Vitus Cathedral, the royal chambers, and the storerooms. Later, the guilty party was named, a certain Kodela, a former servant who set fire to his master's house out of revenge. This explanation was accepted. No further investigation was conducted. And along with the archives, nearly all the Zimsky tables. The books that were forbidden to touch, which were read from the balcony, which had been preserved since the 13th century, they disappeared in just a few hours. Of the hundreds of volumes, only one remained. The sole book from the period between the years 1316 and 1324. One out of hundreds. Think about it. A system that was built for almost 3 centuries. A mechanism that made the very existence of Czech nobility as an independent force possible. The legal memory of a nation, from the first Přemyslid to the mid-16th century. All of this was housed in one archive, and all of it disappeared in one day. Now, an important context, which is usually spoken of quietly. In the year 1541, the Habsburgs were completing the consolidation of Bohemia. Ferdinand I had just crushed a serious uprising of the Czech nobility and sought centralization. The Czech nobility clung to its rights, rights that were specifically recorded in the land tables. Without these documents, the nobles had no legal basis for their appeals. There were no precedents. There was no way to prove that their privileges existed before the Habsburgs came to power. In fact, without the land tables, the Czech nobility became merely a collection of landowners, whose rights to their estates were now defined by the same crown that sought to fully subjugate them. After the fire, the books began to be numbered, mechanically, in order, stripping them of the sacredness that made the system inviolable. This is considered the end of the old Czech legal system. Not a reform, not a gradual displacement, not negotiations. An end, in one day, in one fire. Already in 1563, 22 years after the fire, Ferdinand enacted the land reform, curtailing the rights of the Czech estates precisely in those matters that were previously protected by the land tables. There was no way to contest it. There was no documentary precedent. Little Country and Hradčany were rebuilt in the Renaissance style after the fire. The old Gothic structure of the neighborhoods was replaced by the palaces of nobles loyal to the crown. The new architectural order laid over the legal vacuum that arose when the books burned. The new Prague grew on the ashes of the legal memory that it itself had erased. Witnesses of the events noted that the fire appeared simultaneously in several locations of the little country. This is technically possible with strong winds and dense construction, but no official investigation into the causes of the fire has ever been conducted. There are no answers. There is only the result, and the one who needed that result. If Prague is a story about how the rights of specific individuals were burned, then the next city reveals something more intriguing. It shows what happens when fire destroys not only documents, but also the very possibility of asking the question, what was it like before? It illustrates how a system rises from the ashes, appearing as progress, and one that is difficult to contest precisely because there is nothing to challenge it with. London, the year 1666. On September 2nd, a fire broke out at Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane. Later it would be said that the owner had not extinguished the oven for the night. Within 4 days, the fire destroyed 13,200 homes, 87 churches, and a large part of the administrative center of the city. The Guildhall, town hall, which had stood since 1411, was burned down along with the registers of guilds, debt books, parcel plans, and legal records spanning several hundred years. They tried to extinguish the fire for 4 days. In the first hours, the Lord Mayor refused to order the demolition of houses to create fire breaks. He feared lawsuits from the owners. By the time permission was finally granted, the fire had already gone out of control. Ultimately, the only way to stop it was through explosions of powder charges that destroyed entire blocks. Some of what could have survived was intentionally destroyed. Later, this would be referred to as a necessary measure. Interestingly, the officials who made the decision to carry out the explosions were the very same people who soon received positions on the commissions for reallocating the burned plots. The damage was estimated at £10 million. The city's annual income at that time was around £12,000. Over 800 annual budgets of the city are in ashes. Now take a look at the maps. Take any map of London from before 1666 and a map made after. The difference is evident even without specialized knowledge. The maps before the fire look like artistic sketches. The layouts of the plots are vague, the street boundaries are conditional, and the geographical references are more intuitive than geodetic. You look at them and understand. This is not a tool for managing the city. It is a rough image of what exists, a drawing that cannot be used in court as evidence. But the plan created by Ogilby and Morgan in 1676, made after the fire, is on a completely different level of accuracy. The world's first full scientific geodetic survey of a major city. The scale is precise, every plot marked to the foot. This plan can be used in court. It can be referenced. It creates reality, unlike its predecessors, which merely described it. Technologies have not changed in a decade. The knowledge of surveyors remained the same. However, such surveys had not been conducted before the fire, and afterward they were carried out immediately, as soon as the ashes cooled. Why did accuracy appear precisely when the old maps ceased to exist? This is a question that cartographic historians prefer not to phrase so directly. Because when a city is aflame, those in power have a rare opportunity to start with a clean slate. And in London, this opportunity was seized without delay. An institution was created which was called the Fire Court. It was granted extraordinary powers to resolve property disputes. The judges sat without juries. This was illegal under the rules that had been in place before the fire. However, after the fire, the old rules ceased to have practical effect because the documents on which they were based had mostly burned. The Court of Fire systematically redrew the map of property ownership in the city. Imagine an ordinary tenant from 1667. His house burned down, the documents for his plot gone too. One boundary, one document, one inheritance. Without paperwork, there is neither. He comes to the Court of Fire empty-handed, while the landowner's representative sits across from him with lawyers. A court without a jury, without original documents. The outcome is predictable. This is how thousands of tangled feudal encumbrances, subleases of subleases, rights that had been in place since the 13th century, all of it dissolved. Thousands of parcels with unclear status turned into clean rectangles. Debt obligations that could not be contested with documents vanished along with the paperwork. The city was rebuilt in 10 years. This is an unprecedented speed. No European city has recovered so quickly from comparable destruction. Someone was very motivated to build. Christopher Wren's architectural plans to transform London into a regular city with straight thoroughfares were ultimately rejected. The official reason was that landowners insisted on their rights. But if the documents for the plots were burned and the fire court was restructuring ownership rights, whose rights were actually defended? Who are these landowners who had enough surviving paperwork to block the plan for an entire district? Historians have determined that among them were disproportionately many representatives of major trading companies with connections to the East India Company. Coincidence? Or was it a group of people whose documents were not kept in the Guildhall? The question remains unanswered. The Court of Fire existed for several years. It operated intermittently until 1676. During this time, it resolved thousands of property disputes that would have dragged on for decades without the fire. The official reconstruction of London did not take 4 days or just 1 year. It continued until the last disputed parcel received a new owner. London has rebooted the ownership system of an entire city and created a legal tool for its restructuring. But what happened in Lisbon 89 years later is of a different magnitude. Lisbon lost not just the documents of one city. It lost the documents of an entire world. On November 1st, 1755, Lisbon awakened on All Saints' Day. Thousands of candles burned in the churches. Exactly at 9 in the morning, the first of 3 earthquakes struck, so powerful that it was felt in North Africa and Scandinavia. A few minutes later, a tsunami arrived. Waves up to 6 meters high engulfed the coastal neighborhoods. Those who fled from the collapsing buildings to the shore drowned. Those who remained in the city fell into the flames. And then, fire. It burned for 6 days. At that moment, Lisbon was the 4th largest city in Europe, the center of the Portuguese maritime empire, which controlled trade routes from Brazil to India, from Western Africa to Japan. A century and a half of expeditions, trade, mapping, and territorial management across 3 continents. And all the documentation of this empire, all the knowledge that made Portugal, Portugal in a global sense, was stored in the royal palace of Palácio da Ribeira, standing right by the banks of the Tagus. 70,000 volumes of the royal library, the original journals of Vasco da Gama's voyages, written by the explorer himself, records of Bartolomeu Dias, the first to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, reports by Pedro Cabral about Brazil, documents from the Indian Chamber, secret trade routes, coastal maps, intelligence on colonial resources that for centuries formed Portugal's competitive edge over other European powers. Paintings by Titian, Rubens, Correggio. All of it has turned to ashes. The damage amounted to 200,000 contos, 2 full annual gross products of the entire kingdom, a scale that is hard to comprehend. But try. The secret of the root is the profit of the next generation. Once the secret was gone, the advantage disappeared. The Portuguese monopoly on trade routes didn't collapse overnight, but it was after 1575 that other powers stopped feeling like they were falling behind. Now about the man who made the best use of this fire. Sebastián José de Carvalho y Melo, whom his descendants will remember as the Marquis of Pombal. It is said that when King José I, shocked by the scale of the destruction, asked him what to do, Pombal replied succinctly, "Bury the dead and feed the living." Then he turned to what truly interested him. In the first 8 days after the catastrophe, he signed 130 decrees, more than 16 a day, at a time when the city was still smoldering and the ruins had not yet cooled. Such speed is only possible in one case, when the plan has been prepared in advance, and the catastrophe has become not a cause, but an excuse. Pombal used the catastrophe for a complete restructuring of the Portuguese political system. The old aristocracy, which had held power for generations, lost its influence, partly because the documents affirming its privileges and rights disappeared along with the palace. The Jesuit order, which competed with the crown for influence in education and politics, was expelled from the country 2 years after the fire, without a formal court trial, effectively by administrative decision. The lower city, Baixa, was razed to the ground and rebuilt from scratch. In its place emerged Baixa Pombalina. This is the world's first anti-seismic regular layout, with standardized facades, uniform heights, and proportions. Each block, each street, according to a single template. The new city looked like a declaration. The past is no more. There is only the future we have chosen for you. There is a detail that is rarely mentioned in tourist brochures. The Portuguese maritime empire was built not only on ships, but on knowledge, on accurate maps, on descriptions of currents, on secret routes that prevented competitors from replicating Portuguese paths. This knowledge accumulated over a century and a half, and all this concentration of the empire's intellectual property was stored in one place, a palace by the riverside. Other European powers, Spain, the Netherlands, England, tried for centuries to obtain copies of Portuguese maps. Some enticed cartographers to their side. Others captured Portuguese ships, hoping to find navigational instructions on board. Portugal kept its routes a secret, and it was in this secrecy that part of its power lay. The secret of the route was the profit of several generations. After 1755, this secret ceased to exist, not because it was revealed, but because it became unknown what exactly the secret was, and whether there was one at all. After the year 1755, we have practically only what we were able to copy before the catastrophe. The originals, legally indisputable primary sources, have disappeared. The authentic records of what exactly was in the archive have also vanished. In other words, we do not know precisely what has been lost. We only know what we decided to document later. Portuguese historians have questioned whether secret maps and the most valuable documents could have been removed from the palace before the fire started. There is no answer. Pombal got everything he wanted: a new country, a new self, a new system of power. And no document existed to dispute him. 3 examples, and each time the same structure. The archive is burning. The authorities act immediately, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. The city is being restructured. The past becomes unreadable. But in 3 cases, the fire had a version of chance. A boy with a candle in Prague. A baker on Pudding Lane in London. Tipped over candelabras on a holiday in Lisbon. The official story clings to these details. It was a tragedy, not an act. In May of 1871, this argument vanished in Paris. On May 24th, the communards set fire to the town hall, intentionally. This requires no proof. It is a recognized historical fact. However, the purpose of the arson is usually articulated vaguely. Protest, act of despair, symbolic gesture. In reality, contemporaries were much more precise. Archivists of that time recorded, the aim was to kill families, to destroy evidence of lineage, to annul marriages, to erase inheritance rights, to render the past legally non-existent. The main civil registry archive of Paris contained all the metric books from the 16th century. It held all records of births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths of Paris residents for nearly 3 centuries. This means that every resident of Paris, every family, every property owner in this city existed as legal entities precisely because of these records. No record of marriage, no legal family. No baptismal record, no right to inheritance. No metric, no you. Prove that you are a legal heir? Here is the metric book. Dispute someone's right to ownership? Here is the marriage record. Confirm lineage? Here is your grandfather's baptismal record. 8 million documents, 11,500 registers. They burned in one night. Contemporaries referred to the arsonists as pétroleuses, women with kerosene. The Versailles press portrayed them as demonic figures, igniting flames in every alleyway. Historians would later establish that the image of the pétroleuses was largely propaganda, a convenient explanation that did not require asking uncomfortable questions about who precisely and with what knowledge chose the targets. But there is a detail that is hard to explain by the chaos of civil war. On the same day, May 24th, copies of these documents were burned. They were stored in the Palace of Justice, a separate building in another part of the city. The duplication system existed precisely so that if something happened to the originals, the copies would survive. It was insurance built by generations of archivists. And that insurance burned on the very same day. To destroy both the originals and the copies in one day, one needed to know exactly where the copies were stored. This is not information that any city dweller possesses. It is specialized knowledge. Knowledge of archival topography, fund structures, and the locations of storage facilities. Such knowledge was held by people who worked with documents professionally. Who exactly made the decision? Who knew where to go? History does not provide an answer. The restoration of civil status records took 25 years, from 1872 to 1897. Special commissions searched for copies of documents in notary offices, in church records, which also burned in various years, and in private family archives. The outcome was incomplete. a significant portion of what was stored in the city hall could not be restored in any form. For all this time, 25 years, a significant part of Paris residents lived in conditions of legal uncertainty. Inheritance rights, proof of civil status, evidence of lawful marriage, all required documents that did not exist. The Third Republic, built on the ruins of the Second Empire, began its work in a city whose past had become unreadable. Historians call it the irreparable void. 8 million names that once were and are no longer. Millions of Parisian families whose history now begins no earlier than 1872, because everything that came before exists only in the memory of those who still remembered. The town hall was restored after a few years. Externally, it became almost the same as before: a neo-Renaissance facade, grand halls, a clock tower. But inside, there were no longer the old interiors with documents that were older than the building itself. A new Paris in a new building without its old memory. There is a question that historians prefer to avoid. The communards operated under conditions of military defeat. Prussian troops in the city, the Versailles army advancing. In such circumstances, people think about survival, about escape. They are not focused on systematically destroying archives in 2 different buildings in the city at once. To act methodically in a state of chaos requires organization, a goal, and prior knowledge of what exactly needs to be destroyed. Among the communards were individuals with professional knowledge of the city, former officials, notaries, clerks from the prefecture, people who knew what was stored in each particular building. Who specifically gave the order remains unknown. But spontaneous destruction burns everything indiscriminately. Yet here, what was needed burned, and precisely where it needed to. Now, look at all this together. Prague, 1541. The Habsburgs complete the centralization. The archives of noble rights are aflame. London, 1666. Tangled feudal property hinders the development of the city. Guildhall is on fire, and the Court of Fire is established with extraordinary powers. Lisbon, 1755. The old aristocracy and the church block reforms. The royal archives burn, and Pombal rewrites the country in 8 days. Paris, 1871. A new republic is built on the ruins of the empire. The civil status archive burns, and the genealogy of Paris is annulled in a single night. 4 countries, 3.5 centuries, 1 mechanism. The official narrative provides 4 separate explanations: an accidental fire in a bakery, fallen candles, an earthquake and tsunami, or an act of desperation by rebels. Each explanation is plausible in its own right. Fires in wooden towns occurred regularly. Rebels burning buildings is nothing new. Earthquakes do not choose their victims. But when you see these cases side by side, a question arises that is not so easy to ignore. Why, in each of these cases, did those in power or aspiring to it receive precisely what they could not achieve while the documents remained intact? Why did a new administrative body with extraordinary powers emerge every time after a fire? Why did the new documentation each time turn out to be neater, more precise, and more convenient for management than the one that had burned? This is not a statement. It is a question posed by a structure of facts, each of which is supported by historical sources. Look at what emerged after the fire. In London, the world's first scientific geodetic survey of a city. In Lisbon, the world's first anti-seismic regular urban planning. In Prague, a new numbered system of books without sacred status. In Paris, new registries maintained by a new state unburdened by the past. Each time, from the ruins arose a more manageable, more transparent system for the authorities. Chance improves something singular in one place, one time. Regularity improves the same thing again and again in different cities, in different countries, in different centuries. There is yet another detail that is easy to overlook. In each of these cases, the reaction speed after the fire was unusually high. The fire court in London was established within a few weeks. Pombal in Lisbon signed 130 decrees in 8 days. The reconstruction plan for the lower city was ready even before the last hotspots were extinguished. This is not the behavior of people caught off guard. This is the behavior of people who already have a plan in place and just need a reason to act. After a fire, only what has been decided to be documented anew remains. And it is this new documentation that becomes the history, clear, detailed, convincing, because there is no longer anything to dispute it. There is no original to say, this is not true. That is precisely why maps become more accurate after fires. That is why registers are more precise after disasters. That is why cities destroyed by fire are rebuilt according to regular plans, straight, rational, devoid of the complexity that those in power call chaos, whereas people refer to it as their history. You walk through cities that you consider ancient. You think you know their history. But what you know is the history after the fire. The history that someone chose to document when old records could no longer protest. The history in the form that turned out to be convenient. Beneath the cobblestones of Prague, under the pavements of London, under the sidewalks of Lisbon, and beneath the squares of Paris lies another city, another history, another version of who owned what, who came from where, what rights were recorded in whose name, and when exactly. We will never know what it was like in its fullness, because someone once decided that we didn't need to know, and used fire to make that decision irreversible. There is one fact that is almost never put at the center of discussion. After each fire, those who gained control over the new documentation gained power over the new narrative, not just over the city and property, over memory. In Prague, books were restored based on witness testimony, and witnesses remember only what it is convenient for them to remember. In Lisbon, new archives were created under the guidance of Pombal's officials. In Paris, the reconstruction of civil records took 25 years and was carried out by people who received authority from the Third Republic. There is no need to create a lie. It is enough to destroy the truth and allow the void to fill with what is convenient. In all 4 cases, fire created not only a rupture in documents, but also a rupture in space. Prague before the fire and Prague after are physically different cities. London is a wooden labyrinth transformed into brick neighborhoods. Lisbon is an organic layout that became a perfect grid. The old-timers remember where certain buildings stood, where the borders lay. But the old-timers are leaving. Their grandchildren regard the new city as historic. 3 generations, and the rupture becomes the norm. And there is no alternative version anymore. Look at what remains. In Prague, one volume out of hundreds. In Lisbon, copies of copies. In London, plans drawn up after everything that could contradict them had vanished. In Paris, 8 million names that no longer exist. Fire does not require explanations. It simply leaves a void. And the void is always filled by those who stand next to it, and who already know exactly what with. You walk through these cities. You see the old facades. You read the plaques with dates. You think you know their history. But history is what has reached us. And what has reached us is what someone decided to preserve when everything else was burning.